2024 was a very exciting year for Fuji shooters, but boy, 2025 will be 100 times more exciting, in my opinion at least. There are currently 4 cameras that are pretty much confirmed or at least heavily rumored to be released in 2025, and a 5th and or 6th camera to come at the end of the year as well, maybe. First, and for me definitely the most exciting camera that has ever been released by Fujifilm. A GFX fixed lens camera that is probably going to be released first thing in 2025. It's going to be called the GFX 100 RF as confirmed by Fujirumors.com, which by the way leaked quite a lot of information that I'm going to be using in this video right here. So if you're curious about new camera, lens, firmware releases, everything that Fujifilm might do, check out Patrick's website, I linked it in the description below. So what lens would I like to see on this new camera? A reason why I'm not the biggest fan of the X100 series is that it's using the 23mm focal length, which is a full frame equivalent of 35mm. This focal length is supposedly what your eyes see, but I'm really just not a fan of it. It seems to be some kind of in-between where it's not wide enough, but also not telephoto enough. When I'm using it, I either long for a more telephoto or a wider frame, so I end up not really using it that much. Personally, I would really like to see a 50mm full frame equivalent on this lens, because I just tend to shoot more on the telephoto side of things. But this is not the route that Fujifilm is going with this new camera, and I can understand why. The crop factor of the GFX system is 0.79, and as leaked, this new camera will have a 35mm focal length. So in full frame equivalent, that's about 28mm. This is a way more conservative approach because it gives the people the opportunity to crop in post. Obviously, it wouldn't be possible to widen the image in post. That's why I can understand why they're doing it. And on the topic of the lens of this camera, I don't think it's going to have a pancake style lens just like the X100 has. The sensor on the GFX system is just too big to put such a small lens there. I know the lens on the X100 isn't just the small bit that pops out of the camera, it extends quite a bit into the camera itself. But I think on this new GFX camera they will go the approach that like it did with their Q cameras. The aperture on this lens will be f3.5, full frame equivalent to f2.8, which is not the brightest lens. It's even one stop darker than the X100 series, but when this camera is mostly used for street and travel photography, I don't think it will be that detrimental to have such a dark lens. Something that they will definitely have to implement with this new camera is IBIS, because with such a big sensor and such a high megapixel count, not having it would be detrimental, especially with this dark aperture of f2.8 when you're shooting in the dark. Not having IBIS in these situations with such a high megapixel count and such a big sensor would just give too many opportunities for the pictures to not be sharp. Now, something that has really surprised me about this new camera is the size it's going to be. It's going to be similar to the xpro 3, which I think will be a huge selling point. Not too big, but also not too small. Because people that want a fixed lens camera and want to use the X100 series but have slightly bigger hands know that it's just a pain to use these cameras, as they kind of just feel too small. Even though people are usually more likely to get into the Fujifilm X system for obvious reasons, it's cheaper, I think this camera can be widely popular if they can meet demand, of course. Comparing prices in the GFX system, the 100 megapixel cameras go well beyond 5,000 euros, while the 50 megapixel cameras still cost about 3,000 to 4,000 euros. It's honestly just a whole different ballpark to the X system. Price-wise, I think a camera like this will have to fall somewhere in between the 4,500 to 5,000 euro range, and I know it's a lot of money, but considering all the other GFX cameras, money well spent. And I say it will have to fall somewhere in between that price range, because if it is more expensive, I think it would be a direct competitor to the Leica Q system, which you can buy for around 6,250 euros. But well, this camera is already a known quantity to the world, so I think it will be hard for Fujifilm to get customers to buy their camera. I think they will catch a big audience with this new camera, trying to poach customers from the Leica Q system. Of course, they will have to be cheaper than them as well. Because one thing I am sure of, this camera and lens will have superb image quality, great build quality, and overall will just be a great camera to use, just like most other Fujifilm cameras as well. Also, as this camera is something that excites me like no other Fujifilm camera has before. If someone from Fujifilm is watching this, I would love to get my hands on a pre-production model to test it out before and make a review about it. Now, this next camera is something that is very close in terms of excitement to the previous camera, and as I've read all the comments from you guys in the previous months, it's not just like that for me, but for all of you as well. It's the successor to the X Pro 3, the X Pro 4, or 5? Let's see. It was confirmed that Fujifilm was already working on this camera in 2024, but in the end it didn't come out this year. I can only see this camera being released in 2025, and I think it's going to be the last camera to round out the entire 5th generation of Fujifilm cameras. That's because I don't see this camera opening the 6th generation of cameras for the Fujifilm X system, because I think that is something that is exclusive to the XH line now, but more on that later. Like this camera being fully black and white, or maybe taking it a step further from the xpro 3 and just having no screen at all. Now I really hope with this camera, just as most cameras in the Fujifilm X system, is that they will bring back the build quality that they used to have. For example, with the xpro 2, that's something that a lot of people keep talking about. But not just that, also ironing out the supply chain issues they had in the last couple of months and years. Because if this camera is sold out in mere minutes and people will have to wait a couple of months to get this camera or actually be able to order this camera again, I think we'll turn away people from Fujifilm. I think pricing wise we will land somewhere around the X-T5, maybe a bit more expensive just due to the current second-hand market for rangefinder style cameras. But I could see this camera being kind of a turning point in the reseller market. Prices for the xpro 3 and 2 are still very high, but I could see them plummeting if they release this new xpro camera and don't have supply chain issues. Now for the third camera, I wasn't even sure if it was going to be released after we got the XM5 a couple of weeks ago. I'm talking about the XE5, and well, the XM5 is pretty much what I expected this camera to be, except the articulating screen and no viewfinder. But according to Patrick from Fujirumors.com, this camera is set to be released in 2025. I expect to see the same upgrades that we saw on the XT50, nothing more, just the 40 megapixel sensor, IBIS, and the new X processor 5. But as we saw on the XM5, they can actually implement quite good autofocus with new firmware and this X processor 5. And I expect this camera to have it as well. Now, just with the X Pro 5, I think this XE5 will also shake up the second-hand camera market, decreasing the prices of cameras like the XE4 to XE2 honestly, but probably also the X100 series a bit, because the second-hand market for XE cameras is, well, also kind of crazy. Back then the XE4 had an MSRP of 900 euros, and if you want to buy an XE4 used now in 2024, you'll pay around 1,200 to 1,300 euros for a camera in good condition. Either way, there have been reports about the XE4 that the build quality had gone down quite a bit from the XE2, 3 and then to the 4, and I hope that they can bring back this good build quality with this new XE5 as well. Now another very unique camera that is coming in 2025 that I don't think was on anyone's radar really. Reported on Fujirumors.com, Fujifilm is currently sourcing a whole lot of 1-inch sensors for this new camera that's going to be released in 25. And I'm assuming it's also going to be a fixed lens camera because, well, with this 1-inch sensor they would need to create a whole new lens lineup, and I don't see that happening. But with this new camera, Fujifilm would have the unique opportunity to create kind of a monopoly on fixed lens cameras with this, well, 1-inch small camera, then the X100 series, and then the GFX fixed lens camera that I talked about earlier. Now there is something kind of weird about this camera, and that is that it's going to be a half frame camera. Not to be confused, a half frame camera doesn't refer to the size of the sensor, but rather the format of the sensor. Because usually with all sensors and all cameras you have a horizontal format, but with a half frame camera you will have a vertical format, just like you have in a phone, for example. This used to be a thing from the film era days when they had some cameras that were half frame cameras. You would load up normal 35mm film, but it would basically split it in two, and that way you could shoot more pictures. So I think this camera with this small sensor is going to be cheaper than the X system and kind of an entry-level drug for people to get into Fujifilm and maybe someday upgrade to the X or maybe even the GFX system. And it would play perfectly into the mix, creating another supposedly cheaper price point to enter the Fujifilm system. I honestly can't really imagine how this camera is going to look and what features it's going to have, but if I were to guess, I think it would be similar to the XT200 camera from back then, basically Fujifilm's entry-level camera. I made a video a couple of months ago where I talked about the possibility of the XT6 and the XH3 being released in 2025. Thinking back to it, it seems unlikely now with these 4 new cameras likely being released. But I suppose even though it's unlikely, it's not impossible. So let's just talk about what would probably happen in that case. So the 4 cameras that I mentioned earlier, I think will need to be released in the first half of 2024, and that way it would kind of make space for the XH3, I think, to be released with a new X-Trans 6 sensor to be released in the later part of 2025. I think the 4 cameras that I mentioned earlier would need to be released in the first half of 2025, especially the xpro 4 or 5 and the XE5, because I think these will round out the 5th generation of cameras in the X system. If that's the case, I could maybe see the XH3 being released in the last quarter of 2025 with the new X processor 6. But even though these cameras are completely different camera lines, I think it would just take too much away from the sales on the X Pro 4 or 5 and XE5, so I think it's unlikely. But maybe Fujifilm will surprise us. Let's see. Anyway, if you want to find out more about this new half-frame sensor camera, check out this video right here.